I never thought I'd hear his name again, even less so like that, thrown into the middle of a casual conversation, as if it were just another name lost among many. I was distracted, pushing the cart through the grocery store aisle, when a voice, laughing, commenting on some banality, said, "Did you hear? Matthew's back." It was as if the whole world stopped for a moment. The noise of the carts bumping into each other, the strong smell of coffee coming from the snack bar next door, the soft music echoing from the radio attached to the wall. Everything dissolved in a second, like smoke in the wind. I leaned on the cart handle, trying to hide the shock that ran through me uninvited. Matthew, after all these years, after everything that went unsaid, the heavy silence he left behind. I felt my heart beat hard, a heavy and ancient throb, like the sound of an old door opening inside me, releasing memories I thought I had locked away forever. For a moment I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, because that was the kind of thing that happened in movies or bitter dreams. Not in real life, but the words kept echoing in the next aisle, reaffirming the truth I didn't want to face. He was here, somewhere in this town, too small to pretend we don't exist. My whole body seemed to go on alert. My hands started to sweat. My legs felt heavy. As lead, and every step I took towards the checkout line was driven more by habit than by consciousness. On the outside, maybe I looked calm. Just another ordinary woman paying for her groceries on an ordinary afternoon. But inside, I was pure turmoil. Every beat of my heart screamed the same question. Why now? Why come back after everything? After so much time. While waiting in line, I tried, in vain, to control the images that assaulted my mind. Matthew with that crooked smile, as if he always kept a secret just for himself. His green eyes that shone like autumn on the days he forgot to hide his emotions. The way he held my hand with a gentleness that made the whole world seem bearable. And of course that last night, the last conversation, the last hug too tight, as if he already knew he was tearing us in two. He promised he'd come back. I promised I'd wait. Neither of us kept our promise, and life went on, or at least I pretend it did, with the rubble of that unresolved love buried under layers of routine, forced smiles, and an increasingly fragile faith in the future. I left the grocery store without looking back. The sky was heavy, cloudy gray, and the cold wind cut through my skin like a living reminder that the past never completely goes away. Carrying the bags in my arms, every step I took on the sidewalk seemed harder than the last, as if simple gravity had increased. Too many questions chased me, but one stood out, throbbing with an urgency I couldn't ignore. Would he come back just to pass through, like someone visiting old wounds? Or was there something he still needed to tell me, something that deep, in my restless soul, I had always dreamed of hearing? And it was there, on that gray and biting afternoon, that I knew. No matter how much I had convinced myself otherwise. I hadn't finished this story yet, and maybe, just maybe, Matthew hadn't either. In the days that followed, I tried to act as if nothing had changed. I followed my automatic routine, opening the flower shop at 7, arranging the displays, smiling at customers with the same rehearsed kindness that had become part of my facade. But something inside me had changed. I was awake, pulsing, restless. Every chime of the doorbell made my chest tighten with expectation and fear, as if at any moment he might be the one to cross the threshold. That same man who years ago promised to return, and who now, they said, walked the same streets we once walked together. I hated what it did to me. The way I unconsciously adjusted my hair, how my gaze stretched down the street every time I heard footsteps outside. I felt ridiculous, weak. But the truth is that waiting for him, even unwillingly, was something my heart had been doing for years. In the silence, in the unconfessed longing, in the dreams that sometimes still came to haunt me. The nights were even worse. Alone in the house that seemed too big for just one person, I found myself reliving old scenes as if they were happening now. The way Matthew looked at me, as if I were the only place he wanted to be. The endless conversations sitting in the back of his truck, the plans whispered in dawns that seemed infinite, and above all, the absence. The silence that remained after he left, without letters, without phone calls, without explanations. I never knew why. I never had the chance to ask. I was left with nothing but cruel assumptions and the suffocating certainty that for him, maybe I had never been enough. And now, after years of stitching my life around this poorly healed wound, he was simply coming back. And I was being thrown back into the eye of the storm. Deep down, what terrified me wasn't meeting him. It was what that could mean. It was facing the fact that, despite all the time, all the pain, all the maturity I pretended to have achieved, the love I felt for him still existed, dormant, wounded, but alive. And part of me, the part I so wanted to ignore, dreamed that he had come back for me. To finish the sentence we started years ago. To untie the tight knot that kept us bound in opposite directions. To finally hear the yes I had kept inside me all this time. But dreams, I learned the hard way, have a cruel way of breaking us when reality doesn't match them. The inevitable encounter happened on an afternoon when the sky was heavy with clouds, as if even it carried the same apprehension that weighed on my chest. I wasn't expecting it, although, deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. I went out of the flower shop to close the windows because of the threatening rain, and there he was, standing across the street, so still he seemed to have been, sculpted directly from the memories I forced myself to forget. For a second I thought it was a mirage, a cruel trick of accumulated longing, but he was there, older, yes, with lines etched around his eyes, his shoulders still broad, the bearing of someone who carries the weight of having seen and lived more than he would have liked. And even with the distance, I would recognize that look anywhere. It was the same one that pierced me years ago, as if saying everything the words never dared to. I froze. Every fiber of my body screamed to run, to hide, to protect the little that remained of what I had managed to rebuild. But something kept me there, rooted to the ground, staring at him as if all the time that separated us was compressing into that instant. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stood there looking at me, as if carrying a whole universe of unspoken things in his chest. And I understood, without us needing to exchange a word, that he also carried his scars. That it hadn't been easy for him. That perhaps the silence between us wasn't made only of abandonment, but of pains I never dared to imagine. When I finally managed to breathe, he took a step forward, then another. But something in me recoiled before he could cross the street. Without saying anything, I went back into the shop, closed the door with trembling hands, and leaned against it as if that could contain the avalanche forming inside me. My heart hammered so loudly it was hard to hear anything else. The scariest part wasn't seeing him again. It was what that meeting meant, that our story, however buried I had tried to keep it, still had unfinished chapters. That life, capricious and relentless, was offering me a choice, and for the first time in a long time, I would have to decide if I was willing to open that door again. There, with the scent of fresh flowers invading my senses, and the silent echo of the past enveloping me like a cloak, I understood that, like it or not, I was about to find out if everything we save for later can really survive time. I tried to convince myself that that encounter might have been enough. A look, a clash of realities, a kind of silent closure. But deep down, I knew that wasn't how unfinished stories ended. Not for us. In the days that followed, The city seemed to shrink around me, as if every street, every shop window, every piece of sidewalk carried the possibility of bumping into him again. And worse, it carried the memory of what we were. I found myself, unintentionally looking away, changing my usual route, avoiding places that might put me face to face with everything I wasn't ready to confront. But it was useless. It wasn't Matthew I was avoiding. It was myself. The part of me that still wanted to see him, hear his voice, believed that maybe not everything was lost. On that morning when I met him again, there was no warning, no possible emotional preparation. I was putting fresh flowers in front of the shop, arranging bouquets of sunflowers and daisies, trying to distract myself in the simplicity of things that didn't require difficult choices, when I saw him crossing the street. There was something in the way he walked, a hesitation mixed with decision, that rooted me to the spot. This time I couldn't run. I stood there motionless, my hands occupied holding flowers, as if they were fragile shields against the avalanche about to hit me, and then he stopped in front of me. The silence between us was thick, almost palpable, as if the air had been sucked out of everything around. "Hi, Calla," he said, and hearing my name in his voice was like touching an old string that had never broken despite time and distance. It was strange how something so simple could hurt so much, and at the same time bring an inexplicable relief, as if a dormant part of me had finally found what it was looking for. It took me a moment to be able to answer. I didn't trust my voice, nor the strength of my body, which felt unsteady, wavering, as if I were back to that farewell night, not knowing whether to hold on or let go. "Hi, Matthew," I managed to say, and the sound was hoarser than I intended, carrying everything that couldn't be said in a few syllables. For a moment we stood there, two strangers with a shared history that weighed between us like a ghost. I saw in his eyes something I recognized immediately: fear. Not the cowardly fear of running away, but the real fear of someone who has something important to say and doesn't know if they will be heard, of someone who carries in their words the hope and the risk of losing everything again. And in that, look, I knew. He wasn't there by chance. He hadn't come back for a casual visit, nor to parade old memories. There was something he needed from me. Something that, even without hearing it, I already felt vibrating deep in my restless soul. And even before he spoke, part of me already knew. Matthew had come back just to hear what had been suspended between us for so long. And I would have, to decide if I was still capable of saying it. The days that followed the reunion were like walking on thin ice. Every time I thought of Matthew, I felt the ground beneath my feet threaten to give way, bringing to the surface a confusion of feelings that I tried, in vain, to control. He didn't push it. He didn't desperately seek me out, didn't invade my life as I feared. Instead, he made himself present in small gestures, stopping by the flower shop to buy a single flower, exchanging a restrained greeting, letting slip glances that spoke more than any words. It was as if he knew that to rebuild something between us, he needed to respect the space he had left shattered, and I, against all logic, against all the walls I had built around my heart, began to allow it. I started seeing him in places where I would never have expected. At the Saturday market, sitting in the corner cafe, reading an old newspaper, walking through the square as if he were relearning the city through my eyes. Sometimes we exchanged timid, short words, like someone testing the water temperature before diving in. Other times, a look, a half smile, was enough for the silence between us to fill with everything we still felt and didn't know how to name. The most painful thing wasn't what was left unsaid. It was what had already been said without a single word. It was seeing that despite the time, despite the pain, something essential in us still recognized the other as home. And then on an afternoon, when the sky finally cleared after days of persistent rain, he appeared at the flower shop again. Different. with a glimmer in his eyes that mixed fear and hope, like someone carrying the weight of a decision on their shoulders. I felt even before he spoke that this moment would be different, that the casual banter, the exchanged smiles, would no longer be enough to sustain what was about to emerge. And when he stopped in front of me, nervously holding his hat in his hands, I knew. Matthew was no longer willing to wait. It was now or never, Calla, he said, his voice hoarse, choked with the emotion he was trying to contain. I didn't come back to reminisce about the past. I came back because I left something unfinished here, and I needed to hear it from you. I needed to know if there was still a yes that could save me. For a moment, the whole world seemed to stop. I didn't hear the doorbell, nor the cars passing on the street, nor the beating of my own heart. Just those words hanging between us, raw, vulnerable, true. My whole body trembled with their impact, with the weight of what they meant, with the silent invitation embedded in them. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a requirement. It was a plea, a whisper full of fear and courage, a last act of faith. And there, facing him, I knew that what separated us wasn't time. It wasn't the wounds. It was fear. The fear of believing that it was still possible. And for the first time in years, I realized that fear only had so much power because somewhere inside me, love had never left. I didn't answer at that moment, not because I didn't know what I felt, but because after everything we were and ceased to be, I knew that a yes said in haste could carry the weight of future regret. And if there was anything Matthew deserved, and that I also needed, it was to be sure. I walked out from behind the counter almost without feeling my own steps, with the sensation that the entire flower shop was slowly revolving around me, like a stage about to transform forever. I passed him without saying a word, feeling the warmth of his presence almost pull me back, and walked down the street as if searching in every step for an answer that I could only find within myself. The city seemed different. The streets, the parks, the familiar shop windows, everything carried traces of what we lived and what we could have lived. Every corner seemed to echo the sound of a forgotten laugh, of a promise whispered on warm summer afternoons. I sat on a bench in the square where we used to talk until nightfall, and for a long time just breathed. I breathed in the longing, the pain, the timid hope that insisted on surviving. I looked at the sky, where lazy clouds slowly crossed the pale blue, and I wondered if that was what it meant to grow up, to carry the past without letting it swallow us, and still have the courage to bet on what the heart recognized as truth. Remembered all the times I imagined what it would be like to see him again. In my most resentful fantasies, I ignored him, showed him that I had moved on, that his absence hadn't left me scarred. In others, more secret and silent, I just hugged him, and everything was okay again. The truth, as always, was much harder. I wasn't the same girl he had left behind, but somewhere inside me, the woman I had become still carried that love, not as an open wound, but as a scar that instead of hurting served as a reminder. Some stories aren't buried, they are roots. When I got up from that bench, I already knew the answer. Not an answer made of impulses, but a mature, whole decision, aware of what it meant. There was no guarantee that we wouldn't hurt each other again. There were no promises of eternity. There was only the certainty that after so much time, after so much silence, I still wanted to try. Because sometimes loving again isn't a blind leap. It's a deliberate act of courage. I returned to the flower shop with my heart beating steadily, no longer out of fear, but out of something I had almost forgotten what it felt like, hope. And when I opened the door and saw Matthew still standing there, waiting, vulnerable in a way that only true courage allows, I knew we were exactly where we were supposed to be. on the threshold of a new beginning. When our eyes met again on that afternoon when time seemed to hold its breath along with me, there were no more unanswered questions. There was no more need for long explanations, lengthy justifications, or promises that carried the weight of the past. There was only what had always existed between us, but which now, without the fear keeping us apart, shone with an almost disconcerting simplicity, choice. And this time, I was ready to make it. I took a few steps forward, feeling the ground firm beneath my feet, as if the world around me had finally stopped swaying. Each movement, each beat of my heart seemed to push the words out of my mouth with a painful sweetness, like a river that finally finds its way to the sea. Yes, I said, without beating around the bush, without excuses, without walls. The word came out small, almost a whisper, but within it held all the love I had silently kept, all the forgiveness I had cultivated in the hardest days, all the hope that refused to die, even when it seemed impossible. Yes, Matthew, I still want to try. I still want us. For a moment, he didn't move. He stood there, still, as if needing to be sure he had heard correctly, as if he didn't dare believe that what he sought had finally been offered. And then, slowly, I saw the smile emerge. Not that young and impetuous smile from before, but a mature smile, full of gratitude, like someone who knows the price paid to deserve a second chance. Matthew crossed the small space that separated us, and when his hands touched mine, it was as if all the broken pieces inside me rearranged themselves into something new, something that wasn't a copy of what we were, but a promise of what we could be. In that hug that followed, tight and silent, the weight of the past didn't fit. Only the present fit, the gift that life, against all odds, had given us back. We didn't need to say anything else, not at that moment. The most important thing had already been said, in the look, in the touch, in the contained tremor of our hands, in the simple fact that we were there, choosing each other again. And in that moment, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, in a forgotten town on the map, I understood what few are lucky enough to grasp. True love isn't made only of grand gestures or perfect endings. It's made of the courage to stay, the courage to return, the courage to say yes, even after all the pain. The days that followed weren't made of euphoria or the carefree lightness we had once known. It wasn't as if the world had magically corrected itself for us. There was still silence sometimes, still hesitation in gestures, still the shadow of what remained between us. But there was also something infinitely more precious, the daily decision to stay. We started slowly, as if redrawing a map we once knew with our eyes closed, but which now demanded new paths, new routes, new silent agreements between two hearts that already knew the price of getting lost. We had coffee together in discreet places, as if learning to hear each other's breathing again, to recognize the small details that time hadn't managed to erase. We walked the same streets where, years ago, we daydreamed about a future that seemed so certain. And sometimes, when the weight of the past threatened to insinuate itself between us, a memory, an involuntary gesture, an uncomfortable silence, a lingering look, a hand finding the other, was enough to remind us what we were, building, not a repetition of what was, but something new, made of conscious choices. There were moments when insecurity spoke louder, of course. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night with fear suffocating my throat, wondering if he would disappear again, if this foundation we were building wouldn't collapse under the first storm. But Matthew seemed to know exactly when. I needed more than words. He never promised what he couldn't guarantee. Instead, he showed up, in the small things, in the coffees brought in the morning, in the notes left discreetly among the flowers in the shop, in the conversations that started casually and ended with revelations that before we would have buried out of shame or fear. What I began to understand with each of his gestures and each anxious beat of my own heart was that loving wasn't never being afraid. Loving was being afraid and still choosing to stay, choosing to trust again, choosing to build, even knowing that everything human is fragile, and in that construction, made with trembling hands, cautious steps, and an absurd will to make it work, something new blossomed between us, something that for the first time didn't need to be perfect to be true. And maybe, I thought, as we walked together through the city on a golden autumn afternoon, maybe that's exactly how love won. Not in grand moments, but in the small acts of courage that choose to continue day after day, even when everything already seems to have been lost. There wasn't a grand moment, an extraordinary event where everything fell into place like in the stories we used to invent in our youth. There were no fireworks, no promises under the stars. What there was something much rarer, much more valuable. The silent peace of knowing that after everything, after so many winding paths, we were exactly where we were supposed to be. On that morning when Matthew asked me to walk with him to the hill behind the town, the same place where we so often dreamed of futures that escaped us, I already knew what he wanted. Not because of the nervousness in his gestures or the hesitation in his words, but because of his look. A look that, after so much time, was made of certainty. We climbed together side by side, our steps rhythmic as if our souls had finally found the right beat. When we reached the top, he stopped, turned to me, and held my hands as if holding something sacred. He didn't need to say anything immediately. That moment wasn't about rehearsed speeches. It was about being there. It was about returning, about choosing, about staying. And when he finally asked if I still wanted to build a future by his side, an uncertain, imperfect, but ours future, I didn't need to think, nor weigh the pros and cons. My yes this time wasn't just an answer. It was a decision. It was surrender. It was, finally, a real beginning. We hugged under the open sky, and it was as if time, that old enemy that had so often separated us, had finally decided to surrender. In that hug, all the promises we never made fit, all the dreams we postponed, all the faith that was broken, and then, patiently and silently, rebuilt. Love won, not because it was easy or perfect or constant, but because we chose to return. We chose to listen. We chose above all to try again. As I felt the warmth of his body against mine and heard his steady breathing that seemed to blend with my own, I understood that this was what I had always sought, even when I didn't know it. Someone who had the courage not only to love, but to return to love again. And looking at Matthew, there, with the wind playing in our hair and the whole world opening, up around us, I knew, with a serene and unwavering certainty, that this time it was for keeps. The days that followed weren't perfect, but they were ours. As time passed, I realized that true love isn't measured by the absence of problems, but by the daily decision to stay. Matthew and I learned to laugh at the stumbles, to talk even when words were difficult, to build a home not around the absence of scars, but the beauty of having overcome them together. Sometimes we walked to the hill in silence, just to remember how much it cost to get there, and how much it was worth it. Love won, not because it was easy, but because even after everything we chose to try again, and because, among all the possible paths, we still choose each other.